I would like to talk a little bit about, the measurement of price inflation. And the government depends on the CPI. There's an old CPI and a new CPI. And John Williams has spent some time, he's a free market person, trying to keep us honest about what the CPI is really doing. And of course, traditionally, the government, when they make reports, they talk about core CPI, and they drop off those unessential things like food and energy. And it seems like the markets very frequently accept whatever they say. Oh, inflation is only 2%. Prices are only going up at the rate of 2%. Of course, eventually, though, I think the numbers catch up even with the government. In the 70s, they did admit that prices were going up at 15% rate. But my question is, talk a little bit about the difference about the CPI. How good is it? How accurate is it? Does John Williams have a good point there, saying that the revamping of it? What do you all look at if you want to know how prices are going up? I know we all look at the CPI and the PPI, and it seems to have the immediate effect. But where do you put your most importance? What price measurement do you use? All three of you, could you give me a comment?
Well, von Mises once said that the housewife that just checks a few prices in the supermarket and keeps track of them is much more scientific than the arbitrary price indexes that are used by economists and statisticians. But I tend to look at something called median CPI, which is calculated by the Cleveland Fed. It's not perfect, and it shares some of the same problems as the CPI itself. But also, I like to look at the raw prices of goods and what has happened over time to them. I do want to mention that these adjustments are just ridiculous. We have a substitution bias adjustment, which if the price of prime beef goes up, well, they don't include that increase. They reduce that, and they say, well, people can eat chicken at a lower price. So the full increase is not reflected. We have hedonic adjustments. If a car gets two side airbags, well, the increase in the price of the car has to be reduced by the fact that, it's a higher quality now. And new technology adjustments, the iPad that someone talked about, when that comes into play, that's a deflating force. Despite the fact that other prices are going up at a certain rate, that rate is reduced because for that reason.
Any other comments?
I think it may be Mr. Williams' research, Mr. Chairman. I'm not sure. I cannot quote the author for certain. But his research on the CPI, he used the methodology that was in force in 1980. And if one were to use the methodology in force in 1980 without the hedonic adjustments, without the substitution effects, and so much of the changes which have occurred, that the price level is now increasing at approximately 8% by that methodology, as opposed to the methodology presently adopted by the Bureau of Labor. And for purposes in our investment business, we pay no attention whatsoever to these fictitious PhD-created mechanisms, otherwise known as the CPI. Even the PPI leaves much to be desired up until, for the longest period of time, up until the Second World War, which was a period certainly before the Great Depression, of the greatest economic growth the world had ever experienced. It was the Industrial Revolution. It was the wholesale price index, which was used to measure the level of prices. And so the CPI and the PPI themselves are innovations. So looking at commodity prices, looking at equity prices, which themselves are articles of wealth in the market and are excluded from the CPI, means to anybody who's involved in business, corporate capital allocations, or, if you will, in long-term investing, one has to ignore the publication on a monthly basis of the CPI and PPI and look at the actual prices in the market, which serve as indicators of the cost of production of producing another article of wealth for the market.
Would it not be true that, let's say we use the CPI, wouldn't some groups of people suffer more by rising prices and other groups be more protected, everybody's not going to be penalized the same way, even if we did look at those numbers. I mean, the average person might spend their money differently. If your income is $25,000 a year, the inflation rate might be much more painful than if you're making a couple $100,000 a year.
Or depending on your age, if a younger person spends a great deal of his or her money on consumer electronics, that personal CPI is plummeting. He or she is in clover. It seems to me, and Professor Salerno will know, whereas I am surmising, but it seems to me that the ancients posited that inflation is not too much money chasing too few goods. Inflation is too much money. That which the money chases is variable. At one cycle, it might chase skirts at retail. Another cycle, it might chase the Russell 2000 stock index. And I think the complacency of our masters at the Fed with respect to inflation has to do with their overlooking this most basic concept about inflation.
Well, conversely, if I may, with the respect to the younger generation and the amount of money they spend on technology with ever falling prices, you have the entire world of emerging markets, not to mention middle-income families and poorer families in the United States, driven from subsistence level to starvation by basic food prices. I mean, the milk price has doubled in the past year and a half. Food prices, we know, have risen, depending upon the supermarket, anywhere from 15 to 20% in basic foods. So I believe that the political turmoil, for example, in North Africa, indeed all around the world, and some of the protests, the intensive protests about issues which in the past in the United States have been received without quite the kind of ferocious protests, I think are related to the frustration that middle income and poorer families all around the world are feeling as the political class is indifferent to what the effect of the commodity prices, the basic food and fuel prices, have done to those on subsistence or near subsistence level, as they feel ever more the threat of starvation.
Thank you. Mr. Schweikert.
Mr.